Welcome, Keith.
Thank you very much, Malika.
Thank you for joining us. Now, just to start off, of course, what is the outlook when it comes to trade within Africa in general so far, as the WTO may have noted this year?
Well, there's a couple of different factors to keep in mind. The rising trade tensions have had a suppressive effect on trade growth. It's still growing at a rate that would have been something we could have pointed to with pride a couple of years ago, but we have downgraded from about 4.4% to about 3.9% our forecast for this year globally. Now, the IMF has picked up on these trade tensions and the fear that they may indeed escalate, and has knocked off 0.3% in terms of its growth projection for sub-Saharan Africa from 3.4 to 3.1% for this year. It's had a paralyzing effect on investment decisions. Businesses around the world are now holding back on making the investments that are so necessary for job creation and growth. They are deciding on sourcing and production because the traditional supply chains are being disrupted.
Okay, thank you for that. Like you say, there has been a bit of disruption in this particular region. Now, many are of the opinion that inter-African trade should be capitalized on. However, within the region, there is, of course, an ongoing trade war between Kenya and Tanzania. In fact, Nairobi hit back at Dar es Salaam with new tariffs on products like flour after, Tanzania ignored a deal that gave Kenya confectionery unrestricted entry into the market. Now, after both of them have failed to resolve this, the imbalance of exports, imports is very much key. And, what is your take on this issue within the East African region?
Well, I think the most important thing that's underway right now in Africa is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. If you look at the numbers, intra-African trade is very low. It's about 18% of total exports, which is a big improvement over what it was 8 years ago. But if you look at it compared to Europe or East Asia or North America, it's a very small percentage. And if you want to get the economies of scale, if you want to get the improved efficiencies, if you want to attack some of these irritants that you see in bilateral relations, expanding the pie is the best way to do that. And it's an ambitious agenda. You're looking at, a lot of this is looking at what we call trade facilitation. That is to say, removing red tape and other bureaucratic obstacles to the movement of goods and services. This is not to say that regional or bilateral agreements are necessarily easy to do. They're easier than a global deal with 164 members, but pointing to the case you just mentioned, the bilateral difficulties between Tanzania and Kenya, this is a good example of this, but it's not unusual to see.
Okay, so it's not an outlier, as you would say. It's something that does occur. Now, of course, the preferential tariff treatment under EAC common markets has to meet the criteria. Both countries have to have their agreement going on. But let's talk a little bit in terms of global relations now, because at the African Leaders Gathering in Beijing recently, the president of China, of course, pledged $60 billion in financing projects in Africa. In fact, $5 billion of this is to buy imports from Africa. And if I may quote, he did say unilateralism and protectionism are on the rise. Economic growth lacks robust drive, and China-Africa cooperation under the BRI is a way to common prosperity that brings benefits to both our people. There have been a lot of skeptical reactions when it comes to China-Africa relations still, as we're seeing. What are your thoughts on this? Well,
I think it's a partnership, and with any partnership there may be some rough edges. Africa very much needs investment for its infrastructure. This very successful completion of the Mombasa-Nairobi rail link, it's 500 kilometers, I think, has improved transit of goods and people. And that's critically important. But African countries are sovereign states, and they have the decisions to make in terms of how investment is channeled, what kinds of restrictions there may be, what kinds of incentives may be provided. It's for the African governments to make these decisions.
Okay. And, well, when you speak of, China, of course, America also does come to mind. And U.S. President Donald Trump has pretty much shaken the foundation of global trade, slapping steep tariffs on billions of dollars worth of goods from EU, Canada, Mexico. We've seen China as well specifically. And of course, they have a massive trade deficit with China. Last year, it was about $375 billion. Now, Mr. Trump's not very happy about that. What is your perspective on this situation there?
Well, he'd like to change the way trade takes place. He'd like to see our organization, the WTO, reform. And his insistence on this has sparked quite a lot of discussion across our whole membership. And Kenya is very much a part of that. There'll be a meeting in 10 days' time of about 14 or 15 trade ministers. Kenya will be there. The idea is to try and find ways to make the system more responsive, to make it more efficient, and to make it more effective. Some of the concerns that have been expressed pertain to China. Some expressed have pertained to the United States. Others are more broad in nature, to do with, for example, the way we settle disputes. We have not had our rule book fully modernized since 1994. We have had some important, very important reforms, including 3 years ago at our ministerial here in Nairobi, when export competition, export subsidies in agriculture was prohibited. We had an information technology agreement, which was critically important, dealing with about $1.3 trillion of trade every year. But the bulk of our rule book has not been updated, well, since before people had cell phones and email addresses.
So reform is part of your ongoing strategy?
I think it will be. I think it will be. The question is, how will this take place? What kinds of reforms? Everyone has a different idea. And it's very important that we get around the table. These trade tensions I mentioned before, certainly they involve the two biggest economies in the world, the US and China, but it's much broader than that. And the array of actors, the array of issues, the complexity of these issues is such the only way we can get a satisfactory resolution is through the WTO.
Okay, now let's bring it back to Africa for my final question. What are some of the trade barriers you think are the biggest roadblocks when it comes to interregional trade within Africa, and what can be done in order to do away with these and to facilitate better movement?
Well, I think infrastructure is one important element, but also trying to reduce the paperwork. We have a trade facilitation agreement that all WTO members signed up to. This agreement was reached in Bali in 2013, and essentially what it does is it creates more transparency. It eliminates the kind of bottlenecks that cost businesses billions of dollars a year. For example, it might be worthwhile to have a single window. What that means is an entrepreneur, whether it's in Nairobi or Dar es Salaam or Kampala or wherever it is, goes to a one-stop shop. All the paperwork required, all the fees can be paid there. This saves plenty of time, days, weeks, months, and as you know, time is money.
Absolutely. So clearly efficiency in terms of centralizing the units whereby people can actually come and do away with all the paperwork required in one place.
There are so many things that can be done. Transparency is crucial. A very simple thing like having a website for your customs office, which tells the exporter and the importer all of the forms that are required, all of the fees that need to be paid. So up front, people know what it is they have to do and there are no surprises.
Absolutely. So everything should then be a much, much smoother process if these were to be put in place.
In theory.
In theory.
Full implementation of this agreement, we think, will shave 14.3% off the costs of trade. And that's a huge margin.
Yes.
If you can reduce that, we believe this could lead global trade to increase by up to $1 trillion annually.
All right, perfect. Your parting shots, of course, on the conference that you're going to be holding here.
Well, we are bringing together businesses, journalists, NGOs from around East Africa. It's an introductory course on the WTO. We are a complex organization. We know this. We think it's important for us to get out of Geneva, to come and meet with people, to listen to their concerns, to hear from them what it is that they see happening in terms of their trading environment, so we can go back to Geneva with a much better perspective on what it is we can do to be of help.
So it'll be from the October 17th to 20th, I believe.
It starts tomorrow and it runs through Thursday, so 16th, 17th, 18th.
Okay, thank you very, very much,
Thank
Keith.
you so much, Malika.
All right, that was Keith Rockwell, of course, from the World Trade Organization, shedding some light on trade, not only in the region, but globally. And on that note, we're going to take a short commercial break. Do stay with us.